Commander Lily Monroe had spent 14 years flying through the dark emptiness of space. But nothing could have prepared her for what the ship's sensors found in the Velar Expanse, which was a region of space where no ship had ever returned from in over 300 years. The signal was old, and it was impossibly old, and it carried a frequency that did not match any known civilization in the entire Galactic Union database. And when Dr. Nora Vance, the ship linguist, looked at the readings, her face turned pale in the blue glow of the holographic display. "It is not mechanical," she whispered while staring at the strange patterns on her screen, and she said it is biological, and something out there is singing to us, against every rule and against the screaming warnings of her crew. Lily ordered the Wandering Oath to follow the signal deeper into the dead zone, and her crew thought she had lost her mind, but something deep inside her chest was pulling her forward like an invisible thread. On the 7th day, they found something that changed everything they believed about the universe. And it was a planet hidden behind a fold in space itself, and the planet was green and beautiful and wrapped in a strange shimmer that looked like nothing the crew had ever seen before. Lily stood at the viewport and looked down at the surface through the ship-enhanced optics, and what she saw made her heart stop beating for a moment because standing on the surface was a figure that could not be real. The figure was impossibly tall with ears that swept back like blades and silver hair that moved as though it was underwater, even though the air around her was completely still and her eyes, even from orbit, seemed to find Lily through the viewport and look directly into her soul. Beside the strange woman stood a creature of nightmare and legend, and it was a dragon with scales that shifted between black and violet, and its wings were folded around its body like a shroud made of stars, and smoke curled from its nostrils. The elf woman raised one hand toward the sky, and in that moment the signal changed, and it became words, and they were human. Words spoken in Lily's own voice. The message was one that Lily had recorded and sent 15 years ago when she was just a grieving teenager who had just lost her mother, and she had broadcast her pain into the void, hoping someone somewhere would hear her. "I promise I will find out what is really out there," the recording said, and those were the exact words Lily had spoken all those years ago. Then the transmission ended with a question that made Lily blood freeze in her veins, and the question was simple, but it carried the weight of something ancient and powerful. "Do you still remember?" Lily's hands were shaking as she gripped the edge of the viewport, and her crew was silent behind her, and the whole ship seemed to hold its breath waiting for something to happen. "How did she have that recording?" Nora asked. But Lily had no answer because that transmission had been sent on a private channel that should have degraded into nothing within a few light years. "Captain, what are your orders?" asked her second-in-command, but Lily could not speak because her eyes were locked on the silver-haired woman far below, and something in her chest was burning like a fire that had been waiting to ignite. The dragon spread its wings, and even from orbit, Lily could see that it was massive beyond anything she had imagined, and its wingspan seemed to stretch for miles, and when it opened its mouth, a stream of violet flame lit up the atmosphere below. "We are going down," Lily finally said, and her voice was steady even though her whole body was trembling. Her crew protested, and they said it was suicide, and they said the dead zone had swallowed every ship that entered, and they said she was throwing away their lives for a ghost signal from a planet that should not exist. But Lily was not listening anymore because she was remembering a dream she had as a child, and in that dream, a woman with silver hair had taken her hand and asked her to be brave and to find her way to the stars. She had forgotten that dream until this very moment, and now it was burning in her mind like a beacon, and she knew with absolute certainty that she had to go down to that planet. "Prepare a shuttle," Lily ordered, "and tell the crew that anyone who wants to stay behind can stay. But I am going down there." To her surprise, every single member of her crew volunteered to go with her, and even Nora, who was shaking with fear, stepped forward and said she would not let Lily face this alone. As the shuttle descended through the strange, shimmering atmosphere, Lily watched the figure on the surface grow larger and larger, and the elf woman never moved, and the dragon beside her watched the approaching shuttle with golden eyes that seemed to contain the light of dying stars. When the shuttle finally touched down on the soft green grass, Lily was the first one out, and she walked toward the silver-haired woman with steps that felt like they belonged to someone else. The elf woman smiled, and it was a smile that held 400 years of waiting and hoping and believing you came, she said, and her voice was like music and thunder and the whisper of wind through ancient trees all at once. Lily opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out because standing this close to the woman, she could feel something old and powerful stirring in her chest, like a memory that belonged to someone else. The dragon lowered its massive head until one golden eye was level with Lilyface, and smoke curled around her, but it was warm, not hot, and it smelled like starlight and forgotten dreams. "Welcome home, little flame," the dragon said, and its voice shook the ground beneath her feet, and Lily knew that nothing would ever be the same again. Her name was Seraphine Theloan, and she had been waiting for exactly 412 years for this moment to arrive. When Commander Monroe and her crew gathered around a fire that burned without wood or smoke, Seraphine sat across from them with the great dragon Vilethrix coiled behind her like a living mountain of shadow and starlight, and his golden eyes tracked every human that had come down from the sky. "You have questions," Seraphine said, and her voice was gentle, but it carried the weight of centuries, "and I have waited a very long time to answer them." Lily leaned forward, and she could feel the heat of the strange fire on her face, and she asked the question that had been burning in her mind since the shuttle landed. "How did you have my message, and how did you know I would come?" Seraphine smiled, and it was a sad smile filled with memories of things long past, and she began to tell a story that would change everything humanity believed about the universe. Long before the first human ancestor learned to walk on two legs, there was a war, and it was a war between the Eldari, which was the true name for her people, and an enemy known only as the Hollow. The Hollow were not a species like humans or Eldari, and they were not creatures that could be understood by normal minds because the Hollow were in absence, and they were a hungering void that had been given form, and they consumed not just life, but the very concept of existence itself. Seraphine paused, and the fire flickered, and shadows danced across her ancient face, and when she spoke again, her voice was heavy with grief. "We fought them for 10,000 years, she said, "and we threw everything we had against them, and our magic burned hot, and our dragons filled the sky with flame, and our warriors were immortal and fearless, but none of it was enough." The Hollow could not be killed by any weapon the Eldari possessed, because they existed outside the rules of reality, and every time the Eldari thought they had won, the Hollow would simply reform from nothing and continue their endless hunger. Vilethrix rumbled behind Seraphine, and smoke curled from his nostrils, and when he spoke, his voice was like distant thunder rolling across mountains. "We watched our world burn," the dragon said, "and we watched our people fade into nothing, and we were helpless against an enemy that was not truly real." Seraphine reached out and placed her hand on the dragon's great snout, and her touch was gentle and filled with 400 years of shared sorrow. "So I looked into the streams of time," Seraphine continued, "and I was the greatest seer of my age, and I could see the paths that the future might take, and I searched for any hope, any chance that we might survive. And then she saw something that changed everything. Your species was so young then," Seraphine said, and her ancient eyes met Lily and held them. "And you had barely discovered how to make fire, and you were weak and fragile, and your lives were so terribly short. But I saw what you would become," she said, and her voice grew stronger and filled with wonder, "and I saw your ships crossing the stars, and I saw your cities reaching toward the heavens, and I saw your stubbornness and your refusal to accept that anything was impossible. Nora leaned forward, and her scientific mind was struggling to understand. And she asked, "What did you see that made you believe we could help?" Seraphine turned to look at the linguist, and there was something fierce burning in her eyes. "I saw that humans do not accept defeat," she said. "And I saw that when the universe tells you something cannot be done, you simply find another way. And I saw that your kind would rather die fighting than surrender to darkness. The Eldari are old and wise and powerful." Seraphine continued, "But we have forgotten how to fight against impossible odds, because we have lived so long that we have learned to accept limitations. But humans," she said, and she laughed, and it was a sound filled with wonder and hope and a little bit of madness. "Humans do not know how to quit." Lily felt something stirring in her chest again, and it was the same feeling she had when she first saw Seraphine from orbit, and it was like a memory that did not belong to her but somehow was hers. "What did you do?" Lily asked, and her voice was barely a whisper. Seraphine stood and walked toward Lily, and the firelight made her silver hair glow like moonlight, and she knelt down so that they were face to face. "I made a pact," she said, "and it was sealed in blood and magic and time itself, and I bound my soul to yours across the centuries." Lily's heart was pounding, and she could not look away from those ancient eyes. "I sent a piece of myself into the future," Seraphine said, "and I planted a seed in your soul before you were even born. And I gave you dreams of stars and wonders, and I whispered to you in the dark and told you to be brave, that dream." Lily whispered, and she remembered the silver-haired woman from her childhood, and she remembered the feeling of a hand holding hers. "Yes," Seraphine said, and tears were falling down her cheeks now, "and I have been waiting 400 years for you to find your way back to me." The fire crackled, and Veltrix raised his head and looked toward the horizon, and his golden eyes narrowed. "They are coming," he said, and his voice was grim. The hollow Seraphine said, and she stood, and her face hardened into something fierce and ancient. "And they can sense your presence and your warmth and your life, and they are coming to consume you." Lily stood too, and she looked at her crew and saw fear in their eyes, but also determination. "Then we fight," she said, and her voice was strong and steady. Seraphine smiled, and it was a smile of pride and hope and terrible, fierce joy. "Yes," she said, "and we fight together, and this time we will win." The first hollow arrived 3 days after Lily landed on the hidden planet, and it came through a tear in the sky that looked like a wound in reality itself. The wound bled darkness, and the creature that emerged from it had no true form, and it was only the cold suggestion of a shape with limbs that bent in wrong directions and a face that was nothing but hunger and emptiness. The sound it made was not a roar, but rather the death of sound itself. And when Lily heard it, she felt something cold reach into her chest and try to pull her soul out of her body. "Open fire!" Lily screamed, and her crew responded instantly, and they unleashed everything the Wandering Oath had brought down from orbit. Plasma rounds lit up the air, and kinetic accelerators thundered, and focused energy beams cut through the darkness. But every single shot passed through the hollow like light through smoke, and the creature kept coming. "It cannot be killed this way!" Seraphine shouted over the noise, and her voice carried ancient knowledge and desperate hope. "And you need Veltrix." The dragon had been waiting and watching, and now he spread his wings and launched himself into the sky, and he was so large that his shadow covered the ground like night falling. All at once, Veltrix opened his mouth, and what came out was not ordinary fire, and the flames were violet and gold, and they burned with a light that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the physical world. When the dragon fire touched the hollow, something incredible happened, and the creature screamed in a voice that shook the mountains, and for the first time it became solid and real. The fire forces them to exist. Nora shouted, and her scientific mind was racing to understand what she was seeing, and it makes them real, so our weapons can hurt them. Lily understood immediately, and she raised her weapon and aimed at the now solid hollow, and she fired, and this time the shot hit. The creature staggered, and black ichor leaked from the wound, and Lily kept firing, and her crew joined her, and together they poured everything they had into the monster. The hollow fell, and it twitched and writhed, and then it was still, and smoke rose from its body, and for the first time in 400 years, a hollow had been truly killed. Silence fell over the battlefield, and everyone was breathing hard and staring at the impossible corpse before them. Seraphine walked forward and stood over the remains, and her face was filled with wonder and fierce hope, and tears were streaming down her cheeks. 400 years, she whispered, and she looked up at Velthrix, who had landed beside her, and 400 years I waited, and finally, we have proof that they can die. Lieutenant Diane Cruz was the Wandering Oath Weapons Specialist, and her mind was already working on the problem, and she pulled out her tablet and started running calculations. If we could figure out what Velthrix fire does, she said, and if we could replicate it and put it in our weapons, then we would not need to wait for him to make them solid first. Seraphine stared at her, and her ancient eyes were wide with surprise. You cannot do magic, she said, and her voice was filled with disbelief, and your species cannot feel it or shape it or command it. Diane shrugged and kept working on her tablet, and she said that maybe they could not do magic themselves, but they could certainly find a way to bottle it and put it in a bullet. Your people, Seraphine said, and she shook her head and started laughing, and it was a real laugh filled with genuine joy and amazement, and she said, you cannot touch the mystical forces that shape reality, but give you 5 minutes and you will find a way to mass-produce it. Is that a yes? Diane asked, without looking up from her calculations. Seraphine looked at Lily and then at the rest of the human crew, and she saw something in their eyes that she had been waiting 4 centuries to see. It was stubbornness and determination, and the absolute refusal to accept that anything was impossible, and it was the same fire that had built cities out of mud and crossed oceans in wooden boats and reached the stars in ships made of metal and dreams. That Seraphine said, and her voice was firm and filled with hope that burned like the sun is a finally. Over the next few weeks, something incredible happened, and the humans and the Eldari began to work together in ways that neither species had ever imagined. Nora studied the ancient language of magic and translated it into scientific terms that human engineers could understand, and Diane worked with Seraphine to capture samples of Velthrix fire in specially designed containers. Lily coordinated between the two groups and watched as walls that had stood for millions of years began to crumble. And she saw elves learning to read technical manuals and humans learning to feel the pulse of magical energy. It was not easy, and there were failures and explosions and arguments that lasted for hours, but slowly, surely they began to make progress. The first successful test of what they called truth-fire ammunition happened on a quiet morning when the sun was just rising over the mountains. Diane loaded a single round into her rifle and aimed at a target that Seraphine had enchanted to react like a hollow, and she pulled the trigger. The bullet flew through the air, and it glowed with the same violet and gold light as Velthrix fire, and when it hit the target, the whole thing burst into flames. "It works!" Diane shouted, and she was laughing and crying at the same time, and she turned to Seraphine and said, "We can make more, and we can make enough to arm every soldier in the fleet." Seraphine placed her hand on the young woman's shoulder, and she was smiling through her own tears. "You beautiful, impossible creatures," she said, and her voice was thick with emotion. "And you have just changed the course of the war." Velthrix rumbled with approval, and smoke curled from his nostrils, and he looked at Lily with his ancient golden eyes. "Perhaps Seraphine was right to wait," the dragon said, "and perhaps humans really are the answer we have been seeking." Lily looked up at the great beast, and then at the elf woman who had waited 400 years for this moment, and she made a silent promise in her heart. They would not let Seraphine down, and they would not let the Eldari sacrifice be in vain, and humanity would fight with everything it had. The war for reality was about to begin, and for the first time in 10,000 years, the Hollow had something to fear. Word of what had happened on the hidden planet spread faster than light itself, and it traveled through the communication networks of the Galactic Union, like fire through dry grass. At first, the leaders of humanity did not believe Commander Monroe reports, and they thought she had lost her mind in the dead zone, or that she had been deceived by some alien trick. But then the Hollow attacked a colony world in the outer reaches, and 3 million people simply vanished in a single night, and they were not killed, but unmade as though they had never existed at all. Suddenly, everyone was ready to listen. The Galactic Union mobilized for war in a way that had never been seen before, and every shipyard began working around the clock, and every factory switched to producing weapons, and every able-bodied person was called to serve. Seraphine traveled to Earth to speak before the United Council, and she brought Velthrix with her. And when the great dragon landed in the courtyard of the council building, the entire world stopped to watch. "I have waited 400 years for this moment," Seraphine told the assembled leaders, "and I have watched your species grow from frightened animals huddled around fires to masters of the stars, and I have never lost faith that you would be ready when the time came." The council members stared at her with wide eyes, and many of them were trembling because they had never seen anything like the silver-haired elf or her massive dragon companion. "What do you need from us?" one of the leaders asked, and his voice was shaking. Seraphine smiled, and it was a smile that held centuries of patience and hope. "I need you to do what you do best," she said, "and I need you to fight against impossible odds and refuse to accept defeat and find solutions to problems that cannot be solved." Within 6 months, the first truth-fire weapons were rolling off production lines, and the ammunition was expensive and the process was difficult, but none of that mattered, because for the first time, humanity had a way to hurt the enemy. Other dragons began to wake from centuries of slumber, and they came from hidden places all across the galaxy, and each one was bonded to an Eldari warrior, and together they formed an army unlike anything the universe had ever seen. Velthrix led the dragons into battle, and his flames created windows of vulnerability that human fleets exploited with ruthless efficiency, and the Hollow began to fall one by one. But the enemy was vast and ancient, and they kept coming, and for every one that was destroyed, 10 more emerged from the wounds in reality. The war raged across dozens of star systems, and millions died, and sometimes it seemed like the darkness would swallow everything, but humanity refused to break. It was a young pilot named Grace Halliday who changed everything. Grace was 23 years old, and she had been flying combat missions for less than a year. But she had already earned a reputation for doing impossible things and surviving situations that should have killed her. When the intelligence reports revealed the location of the primary Hollow breach, the source of all the wounds in reality, the military leaders knew that destroying it would cripple the enemy, but no one knew how to get close enough. The breach was surrounded by thousands of Hollow, and any fleet that approached would be torn apart before it could get within weapons range. "I can do it," Grace said when she heard about the mission, and everyone in the briefing room turned to stare at her. The plan was insane, and it called for a single pilot to fly a small fighter through the Hollow defenses while carrying a truth-fire warhead powerful enough to seal the breach forever. No one expected her to survive. Lily tried to talk her out of it, and she said that there had to be another way, and that they could not ask someone to throw their life away. Grace just smiled, and she looked at the Admiral with eyes that held no fear. "Someone has to do it," she said, "and I would rather it be me than someone with a family waiting for them at home." The night before the mission, Grace sat on the hull of her fighter and looked up at the stars, and Velthrix landed beside her, and his massive form blocked out half the sky. "You are brave little human," the dragon said, and his voice was gentle. Grace laughed and shook her head and said she was not brave, and she was just too stubborn to let the darkness win. That Velthrix said, and smoke curled from his nostrils in what might have been a chuckle, is what bravery looks like. The next morning, Grace climbed into her fighter and powered up the engines, and the entire fleet watched as she shot toward the breach like a bullet fired into the heart of darkness. "This is Halliday," she transmitted, as her ship screamed through waves of hollow that tried to tear her apart, and tell my mom I am sorry I missed her birthday, and tell that big purple lizard that he still owes me a drink. Vielthrix roared, and it was a sound of grief and pride and terrible hope. Grace reached the breach, and she armed the warhead, and in the last moment before everything went white, she thought about her mother and her friends, and the silver-haired elf who had waited 4 centuries for humanity to save the universe. The explosion was visible from 1,000 light-years away. The breach collapsed, and reality healed, and the hollow that had been pouring through suddenly found themselves cut off from their source. Grace Halliday was declared killed in action, and her name was added to the memorial wall on Luna, and people across the galaxy wept for the young pilot who had given everything. 3 days later, Velthrix landed at the site where the breach had been, and he was carrying something in his claws, and when he landed, Lily ran forward and found Grace Halliday unconscious but alive. The doctors could not explain how she had survived, and the explosion should have vaporized her completely, but somehow her ship had held together just long enough for Vielthrix to reach her. When asked how she survived, Vielthrix gave an answer that would become legend. "She refused to stop existing," the dragon said, and his voice was filled with wonder and respect, and the hollow tried to unmake her, and she simply disagreed. Grace woke up 3 days later, and the first thing she said was that someone still owed her a drink. Seraphine stood at the foot of her bed and watched the young pilot laugh with her friends, and for the first time in 400 years, she allowed herself to believe that they might actually win this war. This she whispered to Lily, who stood beside her, "And this is why I waited, and this is what I saw, and not your weapons, and not your science, but this." She gestured at Grace, and at the doctors, and at the soldiers who were crying with joy because their friend had come back from the dead. "The absolute infuriating refusal of your kind to accept that anything is impossible," Seraphine said, and she was crying too. "And it is the most beautiful thing I have ever seen." The final battle for real space took place in the Valar Expanse, where everything had begun, and where Lily had first heard the signal that led her to Seraphine. The Hollow had gathered their remaining forces at the site of the original breach, and it was the wound that Seraphine herself had sealed 400 years ago, when she had sacrificed everything to buy time for a species that did not even exist yet. Now that ancient wound was tearing open again, and something vast and terrible was pushing through from the other side. The king of Hollow Seraphine said, and her voice was hollow with dread and the first absence, and the thing that started the war before my people even had a name for it. The combined human and Eldari fleet hung in space above the wound, and thousands of ships carrying millions of soldiers and dozens of dragons, all waiting for the order to attack. But Seraphine had called a meeting on the bridge of the Wandering Oath, which had become the flagship of the Allied forces, and when she spoke, her words carried the weight of final things. "The king cannot be killed," she said, and her ancient eyes swept across the faces of the commanders and leaders who had gathered, and not by fire and not by weapon and not by any force in this reality or the next. "Then what do we do?" Lily asked, and her voice was steady, but her heart was breaking, because she could see something in Seraphine eyes that she did not want to understand. "We do not kill it," Seraphine said, and she stood and walked to the viewport where the wound in reality pulsed with hungry darkness, and we make it real and permanently, and we force it to exist so completely that it can never return to the void. How Lily asked again, and she already knew the answer, but she needed to hear it, with a promise. Seraphine said, and she turned to face Lily, and she was smiling that sad, beautiful smile that Lily had first seen 400 years in the past, when she was just a child, dreaming of a silver-haired woman, and kept the bridge was silent, And everyone understood what Seraphine was saying, and Lily felt tears burning in her eyes. "There has to be another way," Lily said, and her voice cracked, "and we did not come all this way just to lose you." Seraphine crossed the bridge and took Lily's hands in her own, and her touch was warm and gentle. "You are not losing me," she said, "and you are setting me free. And for 400 years I have carried this burden, and now it is time to let it go." Valthrix was waiting on the observation deck, and when Seraphine walked out to meet him, he lowered his great head and pressed his snout to her forehead, and smoke curled around them both. "400-years-old friend," Seraphine whispered, "and it has been an honor." The honor, Valthrix rumbled, and his golden eyes were shining with tears that dragons were not supposed to be able to cry, was mine. Lily followed them out, and she stood beside Seraphine and looked out at the wound in reality that was growing larger with every passing moment. "Do you still remember our promise?" Seraphine asked. And she did not look at Lily, but her voice was filled with love and hope and the weight of centuries. And Lily did remember, and she remembered the dream from her childhood, and she remembered the silver-haired woman who had held her hand and whispered words of courage, and she remembered the feeling of being connected to something vast and ancient and beautiful. "I remember," Lily said, and her voice was breaking. Seraphine nodded, and then she stepped off the observation deck and fell toward the wound in reality below. Valthrix dove after her, and his wings caught her, and together they flew into the heart of the darkness, and Lily watched them go, and she was screaming, but no sound came out. What happened next was something that no sensor could fully capture and no words could truly describe. Light erupted from the wound, and it was pure and absolute and impossible, and it burned away the darkness like the sun burning away morning fog. Those who were there would speak of hearing a voice, and it was ancient and powerful, and it spoke a single word in a language older than time itself, Will. The King of Hollow screamed as existence was forced upon it, and 400 years of waiting and hoping and believing poured into that single moment, and the creature that had haunted the galaxy since before memory was ended. The wound healed, and reality snapped back into place, and suddenly the sky was just the sky, and the stars were just stars, and the war was over. Lily fell to her knees, and she was sobbing, and she thought she had lost Seraphine forever. But then Valthrix emerged from where the wound had been, and he was carrying something in his claws. And when he landed on the observation deck, Lily saw that it was Seraphine. She was different now, and the glow of ancient magic had faded from her skin, and her silver hair was streaked with gray, and when she opened her eyes, they were no longer the eyes of an immortal being. "I am mortal now," Seraphine said, and her voice was weak but filled with joy, "and the magic that sustained me for centuries is gone, and I will grow old and die like any human worth it," she said, and she was laughing and crying at the same time, and every year and every day and worth it. Lily held her, and Valthrix curled around them both, and somewhere in the distance the fleet was celebrating because the war was over and the darkness had been defeated. 10 years later, on a small blue planet called Earth, an old woman with silver hair sat on a porch watching the sunset. With her dearest friend Valthrix had coiled himself in the adjacent field because he was too large for the yard, and his great head rested near the porch, so Seraphine could lean against his snout. Lily Monroe. Now Admiral Monroe retired, walked up the path with her granddaughter, and the little girl was 7 years old, with bright, curious eyes. "Grandma says you saved the whole galaxy," the child said, and she climbed onto the porch without any fear. Seraphine smiled, and she looked so different now, with wrinkles around her eyes and gray in her hair, but she was still beautiful. "I made a promise," she said, "and I kept it. And that is all. Can I make a promise too?" The child asked. Seraphine studied the little girl for a long moment, and then she took her small hand. "What would you promise?" she asked. The girl thought about it very seriously, and then she said, "I promise to be brave and to find something worth waiting for." Seraphine eyes filled with tears, and she looked at Veilthrix, who rumbled softly, and then at Lily, who was smiling through her own tears. "Then make it," Seraphine whispered, "and keep it, and no matter how long it takes, the sun set on earth and the sky turned orange and pink and purple, and somewhere far above the stars were coming out one by one. And in the vast expanse of space, those stars burned a little brighter, because the darkness that had threatened to consume everything was gone forever, because an elf woman had made a promise 400 years ago, and because humanity had been stubborn enough to help her keep it." The end.